The overall border between India and Pakistan is often regarded as the second most heavily militarized border in the world today, only after the border between North and South Korea. And it is so heavily militarized and covered by hundreds of thousands of floodlights that it is one of the few international borders that can be clearly viewed from space. And in order to understand why this border is so militarized today, why Kashmir is such a dangerous and hotly disputed area between their armies that experiences frequent terror attacks, and why India and Pakistan are such arch nemesis today, you need to understand how modern India, Pakistan, and Kashmir all came to be in the first place. And for a lot of that, as with most other major modern controversial border disputes, you can thank the British. For nearly 200 years from 1757, the British dominated much of India through indirect and later direct colonial rule. But by the time of the mid-1940s, after Britain became exhausted and financially depleted by the fighting of the Second World War, it became clear to Britain that it could no longer afford to continue hanging on to the whole of India as a colonial possession any longer. And so the question then arose of how the British would transition their centuries of rule across an entire subcontinent towards independence. There were many different ideas of how exactly to do that at the time, but the British ultimately decided that they would partition their colonial possessions in India between the subcontinent's two largest religious groups, a Hindu-majority state that they called the Dominion of India, and a Muslim-majority state that they called the Dominion of Pakistan. In early 1947, the final British colonial viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, irrevocably and hastily set the deadline for India and Pakistan's independence for the 15th of August, within only a matter of months without the final borders being yet decided. In order to figure out what the final borders between India and Pakistan would be, Lord Mountbatten and the local Hindu and Muslim representatives brought in a British lawyer to draw them up, who was named Sir Cyril Radcliffe, whose task became to draw out the lines across the subcontinent that would divide Hindu-majority areas from Muslim-majority areas in as fair of a way as possible. Interestingly, Radcliffe had never even set foot in India before he arrived for this very high-stakes task, and he also had no prior experience with drawing any borders. Because of this, however, he was actually viewed as an asset by everyone involved in the process due to his perceived neutrality and impartiality to the interests of Hindus and Muslims. After he arrived, he was only given 5 weeks to draw out the borders that would decide the futures of hundreds of millions of people. There was probably no possible way that anyone could have drawn the borders in this scenario under such a tight deadline that would not have led to incredible violence. Radcliffe did his best and drew out his borders generally based on pre-existing internal subdivisions and rivers in the west and in the east, dividing the historically unified regions of Punjab and Bengal between their Hindu and Muslim majority areas. As they were still being drawn, rumors of where the final borders would end up being located led to mounting suspicions and violence between the Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim communities the lines would ultimately divide. And as the violence began escalating into increasingly deadly sectarian riots and pogroms, Lord Mountbatten ordered that the final publication of the Radcliffe borders be delayed by 2 days after India and Pakistan were actually granted their independence, generally viewed as a way for Britain to deflect the blame away for the inevitable violence that they knew was likely to follow. So for 2 astonishing days after the 15th of August in 1947, India and Pakistan were both declared to be independent states without either country actually knowing what their final borders with each other looked like, leading to mass confusion, panic, and violence as Muslims and Hindus fought over what side they would belong to. Finally, 2 days later after the finalized Radcliffe borders were revealed, the building pressure and violence exploded to catastrophic levels as millions of Hindus and Sikhs suddenly found themselves in Pakistan, while millions of Muslims suddenly found themselves in India. Intercommunal and sectarian tensions that had been stoked for years exploded, and an outpouring of pogroms and ethnic cleansings took place involving both sides, while possibly the largest mass migration ever seen in human history began, as millions of Hindus and Sikhs abandoned everything in one direction for India, and millions of Muslims abandoned everything in the other direction for Pakistan. Many of them never ended up making it alive. Within only a year, by 1948, around 1 million people across the subcontinent had been killed by the violent effects of the partition, while around 15 million other people had become displaced and their lives uprooted to the other side of a brand new border. A horrific tragedy that has left deep, long-lasting memories of trauma and mistrust in both the Indian and Pakistani populations of each other to this day. To give just a brief example of how massively the demographics of the subcontinent were irrevocably changed by the partition, the city of Karachi in modern Pakistan had a pre-partition population that was nearly 48% Hindu and only 42% Muslim, while Delhi in modern India had a pre-partition population that was 40% Muslim. After the partition, virtually all of Karachi's Hindu population had fled or was expelled, while hundreds of thousands of Muslims had been pushed out of Delhi. And the two cities are now overwhelmingly Muslim and Hindu communities respectively. Horrified at the levels of violence that exploded in the subcontinent after his lines were revealed, Radcliffe himself burned all of his own papers relating to how he drew them and then left the subcontinent to never return again, just 5 weeks after he had arrived. The final borders he drew left a Pakistan divided between western and eastern halves separated by more than 1,000 miles across open Indian territory, with the former historically unified regions of Punjab and Bengal divided between India and Pakistan as well based on religious identity. And in addition to the lines that he drew on the map, there were 565 political entities within the subcontinent before the partition that were known as princely states, which were largely autonomous territories ruled by local monarchs who recognized the suzerainty of the British Crown. While varying dramatically in size and population, all 565 of these princely states made up about 40% of the subcontinent's territory and about 23% of its population at the time of the partition. And each of their rulers were left with the ultimate decision to join with either India or Pakistan. While the overwhelming majority of these princely states made their decision to join one or the other based on contiguous geography or demographics, 3 of the princely states' rulers chose alternative paths that caused conflicts in Hyderabad, Junagadh, and most controversially of all, in Kashmir. Hyderabad, the largest and wealthiest of the princely states, was governed by a Muslim ruler who presided over a majority Hindu population, and he opted for independence instead of joining with either India or Pakistan. A communist insurgency against this Muslim ruler erupted in Hyderabad that he failed to contain. And then, fearful of a landlocked communist state emerging surrounded by their territory, India decided to invade Hyderabad shortly after in 1948 to crush the rebellion, and then pressured the Muslim ruler to join with India in the process. Junagadh was slightly more controversial. Like Hyderabad, this was another princely state that was governed by a Muslim ruler but which had an overwhelmingly Hindu majority population. But despite the majority Hindu population, and despite not being directly connected to the rest of Pakistan by land, the Muslim ruler of Junagadh decided that the territory would still join with Pakistan, which Pakistan knew would be highly controversial if they accepted. So it took Pakistan an entire month of deliberating to eventually accept Junagadh, which India refused to acknowledge on the basis of Junagadh's overwhelming Hindu majority population, and it being completely surrounded on all of its sides by India. So India blockaded Junagadh, riots erupted inside and quickly got out of control, and the Muslim ruler fled for his life to Pakistan. Indian forces then advanced into Junagadh and hosted a plebiscite there on which country to join, which more than 99% of the votes cast chose India. And so India annexed Junagadh. Remember all of this for what's about to come next, because the dispute that arose in the other controversial princely state, Kashmir, was sort of the opposite scenario of this, because unlike Hyderabad and Junagadh, Kashmir was governed by a Hindu ruler who presided over a Muslim majority population. The princely state of Kashmir, roughly the same geographic size as the US state of Utah at the northernmost extremity of the subcontinent, had been effectively cobbled together by the British themselves a century before the partition back in 1846. Out of several different historical regions that had been under the control of various rulers of different faiths and backgrounds at different times. Back then, it wasn't the British Crown that put the princely state of Kashmir together, but the British East India Company, a private corporation, which installed a previously lowly chieftain they felt they could control on the Kashmiri throne. What we think of as Kashmir today was, and is, in truth, made up of several different distinct historical regions that Kashmir itself is only a part of. It consisted of the densely populated and heavily Muslim and Kashmiri-speaking Kashmir Valley, which lent the overall princely state its name. The predominantly Hindu and majority Dogri-speaking Jammu that included a large Muslim minority, and the sparsely populated, roughly equally split Buddhist and Muslim and largely Tibetan-speaking Ladakh. The East India Company installed a Hindu dynasty from the Jammu region onto the throne of Kashmir, who always lacked legitimacy within the Kashmir Valley and Ladakh regions that had majority non-Hindu populations. A century later, in 1947, at the time of partition, the still Hindu ruler of Kashmir, the Maharaja Hari Singh, proved indecisive on choosing which path to pursue. He alone possessed the legal right to take all of Kashmir into either India or to Pakistan. But he also initially desired to pursue a third path like the ruler of Hyderabad had attempted, and he wanted to make Kashmir an independent nation. Both India and Pakistan attempted to apply pressure on Kashmir after their independence to sway the Maharaja to their side. While the Muslim majority of Kashmir generally looked towards Pakistan, and the Hindu and Buddhist minorities in Jammu and Ladakh generally looked towards India. All across the princely state of Kashmir at the time in 1947, the total population was 77% Muslim, with a significant 20% Hindu minority. As the pressure mounted and the future remained uncertain, a revolt broke out among the Muslim community in Kashmir's western Poonch region, which was quickly supported by thousands of Pakistani tribesmen who were allegedly armed and supported by the Pakistani government, who crossed over the border into Kashmir in either an invasion or an intervention, depending on your perspective. The Hindu Maharaja of Kashmir was not capable of stopping this assault and the rebellion on his own, and so he asked for India's military assistance in repelling them. India then clarified that they would indeed be willing to send their military support to repel the Pakistanis and quash the rebellion, but only on the condition that the Maharaja finally made up his mind and joined Kashmir to India in exchange. Under this enormous pressure, the Hindu ruler of Kashmir agreed with India and signed the document to incorporate his Muslim-majority state into India instead of Pakistan. The Indian army then advanced into Kashmir. The Pakistanis refused to recognize the decision based on Kashmir's Muslim-majority population and refused to back down, and so began the first war between India and Pakistan almost immediately after they both were born together. And so the high mountains of Kashmir became a fiercely contested battlefield. Now, while both India and Pakistan wanted all of Kashmir for ideological and nationalist reasons, they also wanted and continue to want all of Kashmir for geostrategic reasons as well. For decades ever since, the Pakistani government and military have frequently referred to Kashmir as their jugular vein, because it is seen as such a vital area for their national security. For one thing, Pakistan knows that as the smaller country, it'll always be demographically, economically, and militarily weaker than India is. Pakistan is also a country that lacks strategic depth relating to India. Pakistan's second largest city, Lahore, is located directly adjacent to the Indian border, while the Pakistani capital city, Islamabad, is located only about 45 kilometers away from the disputed Kashmir territory. If India were to hypothetically initiate an all-out conventional invasion of Pakistan, they could use Kashmir as a position to attack the capital city with artillery and missiles, while the main Indian army drives across the relatively flatter land from the south. Were Pakistan to control all of Kashmir instead, they would eliminate India's ability to quickly outflank the capital during a conflict, and they would improve their strategic depth relative to India significantly. Moreover, without Kashmir, Pakistan would have no direct access to what has become their greatest geopolitical ally, China. China maintains a significant number of separate territorial disputes with India as well, and so on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Pakistan and China have drawn increasingly closer together over the decades due to their shared rivalry and territorial disputes with India. The relationship between them has gotten even more serious in the 21st century, as Pakistan has become the keystone project in China's overall Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2015, China has invested more than $65 billion into what they call the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a series of thousands of kilometers worth of paved highways and railways that sprawl out from Pakistan's Arabian Sea port of Gwadar across the country into China's western Xinjiang province. This route, built up at tremendous expense and effort over the past decade, enables China to import some oil from the Persian Gulf without that oil having to travel through the strategic Strait of Malacca, which China fears the US Navy could blockade and shut down in the event of a war between them. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor therefore gives China greater strategic flexibility with energy resources by providing them with an alternative, more secure supply route. And it's given Pakistan tens of billions of dollars for development and further solidified their bond with China. And the linchpin of the whole project is, of course, Kashmir, which is the only way that Pakistan and China are able to directly connect with one another, and thus why China is highly incentivized to see Kashmir more in the hands of Pakistan than with India. India, meanwhile, is perennially afraid of being forced into facing its ultimate worst-case scenario, a two-front war against Pakistan and China at the same time, fought over each of their major claims in Kashmir in the west and China's claim to Arunachal Pradesh in the east. If India were able to establish full control over Kashmir, it would geographically split its two biggest regional rivals apart from one another, and it would eliminate China's biggest reason for being aligned with Pakistan in the first place, while it would also grant India a direct land border with Afghanistan and a window of influence into Central Asia. But perhaps the biggest strategic value to Kashmir from both India and Pakistan's perspectives is the hold that the territory has over both of their water supplies. The Indus River and its tributaries begin high up in the mountains of Chinese-controlled Tibet, but the Indus itself and many of its tributaries all flow through the territory of Kashmir first before they later enter into Pakistan and flow down to the river's mouth on the Arabian Sea. The Indus River is Pakistan. It provides almost 3/4 of Pakistan's entire water supply for the country's 250+ million people today, and it's the leading source for the country's irrigation and agricultural industry, which accounts for 23% of the country's total GDP. 90% of Pakistan's entire population lives within the Indus River's basin, while dams along the river generate 1/5 of Pakistan's total electricity supply. This is the main reason why the Pakistani military refers to Kashmir as their jugular vein. If Pakistan were to control all of Kashmir, they would be able to fully secure all of their water supply. But if India were to control all of it, Pakistan would always fear that India would be able to restrict or even shut down their water supply along the Indus and throw the entire country's future into jeopardy. These strategic stakes and interests, on top of their nationalist claims based on the territory's Muslim majority for Pakistan and the former Hindu ruler's decision for India, have always meant that Kashmir would be seen as a core national interest to both Pakistan and India alike, and what has contributed to the bitterness of their fight over it for nearly 80 years now. For just over a year after October of 1947, the Indian and Pakistani armies battled each other within Kashmir for control of the territory, and the front lines gradually solidified around what initially became known only as the ceasefire line, after both sides agreed to a ceasefire in January of 1949. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, and by the end of it, India controlled roughly 63% of the territory of the former princely state, including the heavily populated Kashmir Valley, the more sparsely populated Ladakh, and most of Jammu, while Pakistan had gained control over a part of Jammu in the west, and the more remote, sparsely populated territories of Gilgit and Baltistan in the north, with both sides left continuing to claim all of the others' holdings within the former princely state as well. The front line between their armies in Kashmir was never recognized by either side as a final border, and only as a temporary ceasefire line as per the terms of the Karachi Agreement they signed later over the summer of 1949. The Karachi Agreement, negotiated by the UN, is what formally established the ceasefire line across Kashmir, while it also, very critically here, reaffirmed the necessity for a plebiscite to be held within Kashmir on what Kashmir's ultimate status would end up being. But to this date, however, the plebiscite recommended by the UN in Kashmir has never actually been held. Ever since, Pakistan has continually accused India of betraying the people of Kashmir by never actually holding the plebiscite, while India has accused Pakistan of making the plebiscite impossible to host by never withdrawing their army from the territory, which India argues as a prerequisite for the plebiscite to actually be held, while Pakistan basically just doesn't trust India if they were to withdraw first. For nearly 80 years now since this all started, little else has changed in India and Pakistan's stance on this issue, while the people of Kashmir have remained divided across a line on the map that has sometimes been referred to as the Berlin Wall of Asia. The year after the 1949 ceasefire in 1950, India formally incorporated their controlled territory in Kashmir as the state of Jammu and Kashmir, becoming the only Muslim-majority territorial subdivision within India. Jammu and Kashmir was also initially awarded a special autonomous status within India by Article 370 to the Indian Constitution, which granted Jammu and Kashmir its administrative autonomy, its own separate constitution and flag, and critically, prevented Indian citizens from other states in the country to purchase land or property or to settle in Jammu and Kashmir, keeping the region's complex identity and status separate from the rest of the country. Regardless, the tensions between India and Pakistan over their competing claims to the rest of Kashmir continued remaining high. And then came the Sino-Indian War of 1962, when Chinese troops decided to enforce their own disputed territorial claims with India by invading their disputed territory with India in Kashmir. The Chinese People's Liberation Army managed to rapidly and decisively defeat the Indians within only a month. China managed to capture virtually all of their own claimed territory in Kashmir that they disputed with India in an area known as Aksai Chin, while India's poor performance and defeat in the war encouraged Pakistan to begin acting more aggressively on settling the Kashmir dispute again. The following year, in 1963, Pakistan diplomatically settled their own border disputes with China and Kashmir. Pakistan transferred some of their land in Kashmir to China, while both Pakistan and China agreed to broadly support each other's remaining territorial disputes in Kashmir and elsewhere against India. Decades later, in 1998, despite the idealism of the 1972 Simla Agreement, however, tensions between India and Pakistan went back to rising again in the 1980s. The new line of control that was defined by the Simla Agreement between them across Kashmir left out the massive, freezing, inhospitable, and extremely highly elevated Siachen Glacier, with the glacier remaining a geographically undefined area between the end of the line of control and Chinese territory, due to the perceived uselessness of anyone actually controlling it. But then in 1984, Indian troops moved into the undefined Siachen Glacier and took control over it, much to the fury of Pakistan, who demanded that they withdraw, which India refused to do, which then led to a series of skirmishes around the glacier between their armies in 1985, in 1987, and again in 1995 that resulted in thousands of casualties, most of them due to avalanches and other natural hazards rather than any enemy action. Meanwhile, Kashmir itself was about to get a lot more violent in the late 1980s as well. The 1987 elections in Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir were widely perceived to have been rigged by a large segment of the Muslim Kashmiri population, who was already chafing against their perception of Indian occupation for decades, which sparked a significant surge in their support for armed Kashmiri insurgents who advocated for violent secession from India. By 1988, a full-blown insurgency had erupted within India's Jammu and Kashmir that remained extremely deadly and violent throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, when more than 1,000 civilian and security forces were being killed every single year in Jammu and Kashmir. For decades since this time, the Indian government has accused the Pakistani government and its intelligence agency, the ISI, of directly supporting and fanning the flames of the insurgency by supplying arms, training, and a safe haven to operate directly to Islamist Kashmiri militants. Decades later, in 2015, the former president of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, confirmed that the Pakistani state had indeed supported and trained Kashmiri militant and terrorist groups throughout the 1990s, a strategy generally viewed as a way for Pakistan to slowly bleed India dry in Kashmir by 1,000 cuts, while maintaining enough plausible deniability that they were not actually violating the Simla Agreement. Over time, the nature of the insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir, armed and funded by Pakistan, gradually transitioned from one being dominated by Kashmiri nationalists and separatists to one dominated by Islamists and jihadists instead, after it began being portrayed in jihadist propaganda as a holy war to liberate the Muslims of Kashmir from the rule of the Hindus. This propaganda attracted foreign jihadists from around the world to travel to Kashmir, that was facilitated by groups like Al-Qaeda, who began sending their own jihadists to Kashmir after the defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan came in 1989. India would eventually deploy hundreds of thousands of soldiers and police officers to Jammu and Kashmir to try and curb the violence, and by 2017, the Indian government would conclude that since 1989, this inferno of an insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir had resulted in the deaths of at least 42,000 people all in, when counting civilians, militants, and security personnel alike, while other independent analyses have cited an even higher death toll of as many as 70,000 or more caused by it, with the majority of all of the deaths having taken place throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, when it was at its strongest intensity. Further, out of the indigenous Hindu population in the Kashmir Valley that once stood at around 140,000 people, around 100,000 or more of them would flee the valley as refugees to India in order to escape the violence, significantly reducing the numbers of Hindus in the region as well. Today, the combined population of the former princely state of Kashmir is around 18 million people, with around 12.5 million people living within Indian-administered territory and another 5.5 million people living within Pakistani-administered territory. The Pakistani-administered territories are almost entirely Muslim, while the Indian-administered territories are still heavily Muslim in the Kashmir Valley, almost evenly split between Muslims and Buddhists in Ladakh, and predominantly Hindu but with a large Muslim minority in Jammu.